Hello, my name is Ojārs Ēriks Kalniņš. I'm a member of the SAIMA, the Latvian Parliament, and Deputy Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And it's my great pleasure to be here for the Riga conference with Ambassador Kevin Rex, Ambassador of Canada. I've always been a long-time supporter of the transatlantic alliance, the transatlantic relationship, but one of the things that always bothered me is that in the past when people talked about it, the assumption was that it was only the United States that was on the other side of the Atlantic. And people tended to forget that Canada was also part of this alliance. And yet, when we look at history, Canada has taken an active role in defending Europe. Your troops participated in World War I, also in World War II. And now Canada is taking a very active role, especially here in Latvia. You head up the Enhanced Forward Presence Battalion here in Ēriks in Latvia. And I could say that as a Latvian, we're very happy to see you because Canada has always been one of our most favorite countries, whether you're a Latvian living abroad or over here. But I'm curious now, it must be an addition to your role as ambassador to have, as I understand it, over 500 Canadian troops here, plus others. Yep. Could you maybe describe what it's like to be an ambassador and to have your citizens actually with you in the same country?
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you for hosting me and taking time out of the SAIMA to be with me. I know it's a pretty busy time for you and your colleagues as well. And it's great to be in the library. It's very quiet in here right now. But I think, if I'm being honest, I probably have the best job in the Canadian Foreign Service right now. To be able to serve alongside upwards of 600 men and women in uniform, along with my colleagues at the embassies here, as well as in Estonia and Vilnius, is really spectacular. If you compare that to my predecessor, who would have started off this assignment, and he would have been the only Canadian government official in Latvia. So we went from one in 2016, 2017, to now a steady state presence of around 600. It's a pretty significant change. So people are always surprised when I say this, but Latvia is now home to the largest single Government of Canada presence anywhere on the planet outside of the United States of America. So we're bigger than Brussels, Tokyo, Paris, Beijing. This is really it. So it's remarkable for me. It's a very new experience. We're definitely growing into it. The embassy is growing and needs to continue to grow. But it's the best feeling in the world.
I had the pleasure of going to Canada in 2017 when I headed the Foreign Affairs Committee. And one of the things that occurred to me is, as grateful as Latvians are about your military presence here, my feeling was that this would enhance all aspects of a Canadian-Latvian relationship in terms of trade, cultural exchange. We already know about Latvia's involvement with Bombardier and the planes that Air Baltic uses. Have you noticed any kind of a change and increased interest on behalf of Canadians about Latvia and anything, let's say, moving in terms of business despite this COVID pandemic that has hit us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to start. So in terms of trade, Latvia was the first country in the European Union to ratify the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, which I
had the honor of passing that in my committee.
That's good. So you know it well.
Yes.
So this is, this is well remembered in Ottawa. Minister Champagne, who's our foreign minister, visited Latvia at the time he was Minister of Trade as a thank you for Latvia being the first country. The trade numbers in terms of percent growth since the ratification in 2017 are really remarkable. The raw figures still have a long way to go, but the trade relationship was modest. So in terms of percent growth, it's been amazing. You mentioned the relationship with Bombardier. I like to say that Air Baltic is arguably the most Canadian airline in the world. The new, what was the Bombardier C-Series and now the new Airbus is made in Montreal, Canada. And since it's the only airplane that Air Baltic flies, it's the only airline that I know of that flies a 100% made in Canada fleet. So that's great. I always tell people, if you came here in a car, you probably filled up at a Circle K gas station, which is the biggest gas retailer in the Baltics, also a Canadian company, owned by Couche-Tard out of Quebec, one of the largest employers in the Baltic region. More importantly, maybe, especially for the government, one of the largest taxpayers in the region. So Canadian companies are here, they're massive, but we tend to fly below the radar. I think the companies, much like Canadians ourselves, are maybe shy, and unless there's a maple leaf attached to something, everyone sees a bottle of maple syrup and recognizes that right away. But there's a lot more to the relationship than that. So it's been great. December 2019, the second largest importer of goods into Latvia was Canada. So Lithuania was first, but ahead of Germany, ahead of Poland were Canadian imports. So that is a remarkable achievement, especially when you consider just how far away we are, which it's not an easy trade relationship across that Atlantic Ocean and most of Europe.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. One other business connection that I recall from a little while ago was in Latvia we have, I think it still exists, a very successful company called Herodium. And there's these guys who developed these wind turbines for, practicing parachute flying and so on. And as we discovered, that was a company that was really invented in Canada. It was a Canadian who invented this technology to allow that to happen. And I think it's the first time that I've heard of where a Latvian company bought out a Canadian company. They ended up, but the important thing was that the family, which had some say over what the inventor had done, fully approved of the takeover because they felt these guys would do a good job. And if I recall, I think it was in the Olympics in Italy where they performed using this technology. So we've got the connections in many ways. A lot of us are hoping that maple syrup will become cheaper in Latvia because we're not making our own. On the other hand, what we offer to Canada is birch syrup.
That's right, birch syrup and vodka.
Vodka as well.
Yeah, Stolichnaya vodka is one of Latvia's largest exports to Canada and one of my personal favorites. But you mentioned the community. I mean, this is interesting because of course Canada also has a large Latvian diaspora, and it is, this diaspora, or in many cases, the children, so born in Canada, raised in Canada, who returned here, today or in the early 90s. I like to use the example of Lulu Pizza, which is the largest pizza chain in Latvia. Two guys from Toronto who came in the early 90s,
yes.
wanted to come back to the land of their parents, coming out of university fresh in Toronto. Oh, there's no pizza here. So now the most successful pizza chain. It's these fun little intimate stories too about the relationship going back and forth that is part of the success of a country like Canada, which is so welcoming to people from all over the world.
Going back to the EFP, I've heard some very good stories about the Canadian troops here, that they're doing a lot of community service. They're going out into the communities, and in fact, my wife happens to run a soup kitchen at the Anglican Church in Riga, and she says that on a number of Saturdays, Canadian soldiers have come to volunteer their work. But I know you're also going out into the community, and I think for us, that's very important to establish these ties so that local people can meet our guests and our friends. And have you joined them on any of these visits? Maybe you could describe that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a program that we call 12 and 12, which is to visit sort of 12 major cities in 12 months, so one major outreach a month. COVID has really put a damper on that. We haven't been able to do one in the past half year, essentially. But prior to that, we would take the embassy contingent as well as officers from the EFP and our Task Force Latvia and go out to regions. I always like to say, a country is always bigger than its capital city. So you work in Riga 90% of the time, but you really need to get out. And a big part of that is to demystify the NATO mission, and as you said, to introduce ourselves. So when we do an outreach like that, it is political in nature, in that we'll sit down with the mayor and the town council. It's commercial in nature. We'll bring our trade officers and do some introductory meetings with the local industry, telling them about the benefits of the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement and looking for natural ties. And then there's a public relations element, especially with the members of the Canadian Armed Forces. The first one we did when I arrived was in Rezigné, and we arrived with a contingent of soldiers with 2 Canadian Army vehicles, and we were able to, in the town square, open up the vehicles for a vehicle display. The soldiers were serving lunch to anyone in the community who wanted to join. Then that evening we did a film festival using a French language Canadian film. As I said, a chance to do some business promotion and doing this all in concert with local officials. And for someone who doesn't have relatives in Canada or has never had a chance to travel or doesn't perhaps understand what the NATO Enhanced Forward Presence is, because they're not in Riga, they're not watching TV necessarily even in the Latvian language, this is really a chance to reach out to the community. And we looked at our metrics from that one day, and between social media, print media, and broadcast media, we figure we reached about 130,000 people. And in a town of 30,000 people, those are great metrics. And so it's something we want to continue on indefinitely. We've had to take a pause again because of COVID for health and safety reasons, but it's, I think, one of the reasons we've been so successful in sharing the message of NATO and of EFP. And then the NATO mission here is interesting as well because, of course, it's not just Canadian soldiers. It is now, with Iceland joining, it is 10 countries plus Latvia. NATO is 30 countries, so 1/3 of NATO lives at Ojārs, 365 days a year, training, parading, eating, practicing, and that is an amazing, amazing story. I really think it is the story of NATO right now, and we have an obligation to get it out as much as we can.
I totally agree. I think when we look at the 3 Baltic states plus Poland, at last count, I think at least 22 NATO member states have troops in all the 4 countries. And sometimes you hear people say, well, that's not enough to stop a full-blown invasion. Well, I don't think that's really the point. We always talked about deterrence and reassurance. And I think what's happened is with 22 flags in this region, that has been the deterrence
Absolutely.
That's necessary. And I could say that for the people in Latvia, it is clearly a sign of reassurance. Because I still remember in 2014, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, it was the first time as a member of parliament I had people coming up and saying, are we next? People were literally frightened. And will NATO come? And I think in the ensuing year, with the support from NATO and from Canada and others, people really started believing that, yeah, this is real. And these countries are here and they're committed. So again, my response is always, it's not the number of troops we have, it's the number of flags that are represented and the countries that are behind those flags.
Yeah, and it's great to see them out. I mean, one of the great losses because of COVID is that we won't have the parade on November 18th,
Wow.
on November 11th. But having participated the past 2 years, to see those 10 flags, plus the NATO Force Integration Unit and the NATO Centers of Excellence and your allies from Estonia and Lithuania, you really get a sense that that Latvia is part of a very proud, robust community. I wrote a piece recently, and I shamelessly quoted one of our officers, but the whole point of this is letting everyone know that we've got your back. As you said, it's in terms of size, it's meant to reassure. This is 1,400 soldiers, but all of those flags, all of those capital cities that are paying attention, and then the draw that is the number of presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, ministers of defense that have visited Ojārs in the past 2 years is astounding. The first Lieutenant Colonel, Canadian Battle Group Commander that I met, young guy in his late 30s, early 40s, 6-month tour. He said, never in my life would I have imagined that in 6 months I would have briefed 3 presidents, 6 prime ministers, and close to a dozen ministers of defense and foreign affairs. And it shines a spotlight on the region, but it's this cooperation amongst all of these countries. In Brussels, sure, we're together all the time, but you're together at the ambassadorial and general level. These are privates and corporals, lieutenants, the ranking officers are lieutenant colonels working together every single day in what is absolutely the shining star of what NATO should be. And as you said, more than 2/3 of NATO involved in EFP, but here in Latvia alone with the most diverse, 1/3.
It's interesting because when I talk to our people from our defense ministry, They say, yeah, having the largest number of countries involved also creates a complication because they speak different languages. But they say that it's been fascinating to watch how people have learned to cooperate, communicate, and that it's probably one of the rare cases where different NATO member countries, their troops have actually been together, working together, yes, maybe in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But they say that an awful lot is being learned, that it's very useful just from a training point of view.
Yeah, we are, Canada, the Royal Military College of Canada and Department of National Defence was paying a big chunk of the bill, but there'll be a book released probably early in the new year, and it's the first sort of critical academic analysis of the 4 EFP missions. And that's a big conversation around it, because you mentioned Afghanistan. I served in Afghanistan, but Afghanistan, we sort of, different nations were responsible for different provinces. So everyone was in the country, but everyone had their own area of responsibility. And of course, NATO does regular training exercises that can last, a number of weeks. But this really, in modern times, is the first grouping where you're together, functioning as a battle group all the time. You mentioned language. Canadian soldiers are taking classes in Spanish and Italian. Other countries are taking classes in English.
You don't need French.
French, the competition between sporting events, so whether it's football in the summer or ice hockey. I did a great event with the Slovak ambassador out at Ojārs, Baltic Warrior, all of these wonderful team building events where, of course, there's competition between the nations. Communications, how to make the radios function when you've got 10 different languages. Yeah. How to get a, Spanish vehicle onto an Italian truck using a Canadian crane. These are things that in Brussels you didn't really have to worry about, and you shouldn't. You're high-level strategic thinking, and maybe during an exercise it's better planned out. But the reality of being together all the time, and we're now into our 3.5 year of doing this, means that you've got captains and majors and sergeants sorting this out all of the time. And the lessons learned for NATO, I think, are going to be really, really invaluable. And so this book that will come out will be the first kick at that can. But moving forward, this is arguably one of the best tests of NATO as an organization over its existence.
Well, the battalion here had exercises this summer throughout Latvia, and I was able to attend, I guess, the last one right across, here, right by Zachisal. And I got to see, it was just a demonstration, but all the different equipment was there and the troops were there. I take it you've watched some of these events as well.
Yeah, lots of them. It's one of the great ones they do is Iron Spear, which is one of the largest armored exercises, and it's a competition as well. And to see these, tanks or armored vehicles from a dozen nations, the soldiers are coming down from Estonia as well, the British soldiers, lined up on a single range. And Ojārs has one of the best live fire ranges for armored vehicles in the region. It's really cool stuff, and you can watch it all on YouTube. I mean, I think that's the other thing about this. There's nothing there that's secret. It's the social media presence of the EFP here is really remarkable. YouTube videos on Twitter, on Facebook. If you want to know what's going on, it's really open to everyone, which is part of that reassurance method, right? As a citizen, you can really see quite visibly what's happening. And if you're anyone else who's curious about what's going on, you can also see quite visibly what's happening. And it's, it exemplifies exactly, in my mind, I think what NATO was always, what NATO is, what it's always meant to be and to show.
I've had journalists ask me, and actually someone in Canada asked me this as well, and that is about EFP. He says, do you want them there forever? And my answer is no, because forever means we're going to be under threat forever. I mean, the hope is that the time will come when there no longer will be an immediate concern across the border, but for the time being, it's still necessary. And as I understand it, the Canadian government mandate is until 2023.
That's correct, yeah.
How is awareness within Canada about the troop presence here? Is there support? Is it an issue at all politically?
It is not an issue at all. And I've been asked that before, especially during the last Canadian federal election, and I can say with a great deal of confidence because there's statements from both the main political parties in Canada. There is no daylight at all between the current governing Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, who's in opposition, on this issue. Incredibly supportive. I mean, both very pro-NATO and both very supportive of this mission in particular. As far as visibility in Canada, we could probably do a better job on that. Latvia, if you're in Saskatchewan or in British Columbia, Latvia is 9 time zones away. So it's not really front and center. I think when the mission launched, because it was so big, we had so many high-profile visits, it really drew attention to it. There was also concern, as you said, it was not that long after 2014. What does this mean? What is the threat? What's going to happen? 3.5 years in, it is incredibly smooth. Everything, the experiences are all so positive, which quite frankly doesn't make for exciting news coverage. So when we have a visitor come, we hosted Her Excellency the Governor General here in the region last year, did a state visit to Lithuania, to Estonia, and then a troop visit here in Latvia, which is her second trip. Our Minister of Defense, Minister Sajan, will be participating in the Riga conference virtually. That'll be his 3rd participation. So that elevates it a little bit, but generally speaking, it's not exactly, I don't think it's front page news all the time, but that's great, right? You don't want it to be front page news. It works, it's smooth, let it continue.
Well, there's one other aspect of Canadian support for Latvia and through NATO, and that was a few years ago. As I said, I'm a part of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and I've gotten to know a lot of Canadian MPs who are active there. And a few years ago, we had a delegation of NATO PA members, and I was speaking to an MP, her name was Cheryl Gallant, and she was asking, what are the priorities here? What kinds of things do you need? And I mentioned that we were starting to develop the NATO Excellence Center for Strategic Communications. And she jotted that down, and all of a sudden, a few months later, I got the word that your Prime Minister at that time, who happened to be a friend of hers, decided to allocate $1 million to each of the Baltic Excellence Centers in Tallinn, Riga, and in Vilnius. So, it's funny because you see how parliamentary diplomacy can work, but it was such a quick reaction. And do you have a representative at the Stratcom Center here in Riga?
We do. In fact, we have Canadian representation in 11 different locations across the 3 Baltic states. So I think everyone understands the battle group, and that's certainly the center of effort. That's 540 fighting soldiers. But in addition to them, we have officers who are embedded directly in the Latvian Ministry of Defense. We have officers at the NATO Center here, the NATO Center in Estonia. The Deputy Commandant of the Baltic Defense College is a Canadian full colonel. We, of course, have our 3 offices. All 3 of the NATO force integration units in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have Canadian officers serving in them. So when I talk about this being, our most active presence anywhere in the world outside the United States of America, it's not just these soldiers who are rotating every 6 months. It's really across all 3 countries in a variety of locations. The other thing that makes the Canadian mission unique when we compare it to our British and German friends is because we're not in Europe, there was a decision that we needed sort of a permanent headquarter presence here. And what better place to do that than here in Riga? So we've established what's called Task Force Latvia, which is a military headquarters presence headed by a full colonel. They are just finishing construction on their brand new office building, which is co-located with the Latvian Joint Command. It will house up to 95 officers, and those officers that are deployed here are here with their family, they're here with their children. Some of them are on rotations up to 4 years long. So the international school here, for example, is now 20% Canadian kids. Really? It's the most Canadian international school in the world because of this military presence, and that's only going to grow. So you were asking, about renewal and our presence. I can't speak for cabinet, and I won't, but certainly the mission is incredibly popular. We're investing enormous resources here, and we have not just soldiers rotating every 6 months, but a great number living here in the community, in Riga, in apartments and houses in Pinki and in Jurmala, children going to school, they're playing in hockey teams and sporting events, contributing to the economy, shopping at Rimi and Max. So really we are very much becoming part of this community in a way that is unprecedented since the restoration of independence in Latvia and in terms of our bilateral relationship.
Well, I've noticed over the years, I've gotten to know a lot of diplomats who have served in Latvia, and very often after their term is up, they end up coming back either on vacation or even to invest in business, buy apartments, and so on. And to me, that's one of the greatest compliments to a country. You could boast about your own country all you want, but when others say it for you, and I'm going to imagine that this sizable presence of Canadians in Latvia could have that after effect as well, especially if once the COVID pandemic is over and people can travel again. I think one of the things we want to do is promote tourism.
Absolutely.
Plus the environment and the climate is very similar. We don't have mountains.
No.
But and lately we haven't had much snow, but it's still, I think, for many Latvians, Canada feels like home, and I think could be the same way the other way around.
Yeah, it's very comfortable. You mentioned tourism. We know that there's been an increase in Canadian tourism to the region. It's hard to track because there's no direct flights. So, if someone flies into Frankfurt and then they fly on here, it's hard to track. But you can track it through cruise ship visits into Estonia, for example, where the ships know exactly how many Canadians. So we've seen a real increase. And I talk about, if you've got 540 soldiers rotating every 6 months, so over 1,000 a year, we're in our 3.5 year. So we're approaching 4,000 that have rotated already, plus the task force, which is around 50 or 60, and all of these other folks who have husbands and wives and boyfriends and girlfriends and aunts and uncles and grandparents, who maybe had never been to the region before, had never been to Latvia, had never heard of Riga, and they're sending them pictures and sending home food and wool mitts and scarves and balsams and all of these great things. That's the best promotion you can do, right? You've got people living here who are genuinely loving it and who are telling folks about that. And it's also an incredibly affordable place to visit if you compare it to some of the other big European capitals. So we know there's been an increase. It's hard exactly to quantify it. And yes, again, post-COVID, you want to see that just continue.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to wait and see. The whole world is going to be very different after that. But I think this kind of exposure has been terrific. And I assume that you do have a respectable hockey arena now out at Ojārs. I know that was one of your priorities.
I think arena might be a stretch. There's a hockey rink.
Okay.
And I think they've largely been limited to ball hockey. But your government just finished construction on a brand new state-of-the-art sort of training gym facility. And Canada was able to contribute some of the equipment for it. But it's really, this is a world-class training facility. Latvia is doing a superb job in its investments in military infrastructure. We see a lot of that in Ojārs. I visit Ojārs all the time, and I feel every time I'm there, there's a new road or a new building. It's changed so much from what it looked like, probably just 3 years ago. But this new facility, the new residential facilities for soldiers are amazing. Our new battle group commander had a great joke when he came in. I think they're the first battle group to move into the new bunks, the new residential facilities. He said, this is pretty good, even if you were an Air Force officer. So I think if you're an Army grunt and you say that, that's a real compliment. And, this is all thanks to the generosity of your Ministry of Defense.
But it's also done a great deal for the economy of the town, Ojārs. I know some people who live there, and they're all very pleased about it because of the increased business, and I think more new businesses are opening up, and it's again, to me, this goes back to this whole idea of transatlanticism, because it isn't just military, it's cultures being able to exchange and realizing how much we do have in common. It's unfortunate the reason why it had to happen. And yet, I think the plus side is that it's bringing our people closer together. And I'm hoping that in the future, the ties between not just the NATO countries of Europe, but the European Union and Canada, the United States, will just continue to improve. Because for us, After establishing independence, I think the two most important organizations for us to join were NATO and the European Union, because we believe in multilateralism. We believe in working with our friends and allies to try to solve global problems. And Canada is very much a part of that. So we're looking forward to further cooperation. And if I could just add one personal note, my connection to Canada, I was born in Germany in a refugee camp, but I grew up in the US. And in 1991, I was working at the Latvian legation, and I was asked by the government to stay on as a diplomat, which I agreed, but I had to give up my US citizenship, which I was willing to do, but I found out you cannot do it in the United States. So I flew to Toronto. I remember it was like December 16th, 1991. I flew to Toronto, went to the US consulate, signed the papers, and gave up my US citizenship, got a visa and my diplomatic passport, and I flew back to Washington, D.C. that afternoon. So Canada will always be a fond memory for that reason. But I'm just very glad to see this continued growing relationship between our countries.
It really is amazing. We hosted our foreign minister here just 6 months ago, just before sort of the COVID crisis, on a bilateral visit. 6 months later, we did another visit in Vilnius, and he invited the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian foreign ministers for what was the first ever Baltic-Canada foreign ministerial. I think the takeaway is we are so like-minded and we get along so well. And as small and mid-sized countries that rely on the rule of law, that rely on free trade, we are great, solid partners. And yes, EFP might be a bit of an anchor that is responsible for this growth in the bilateral relationship. But what we're finding out about it is what great partners we have in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Estonia. And as a result of the minister's 2 visits in 6 months, they've now established a permanent Baltic-Canada foreign ministerial that will happen every 12 months. And Minister Champagne has offered to host the next one in Quebec City, COVID pending. And that's going to be a great permanent realization of the change in the dynamic of the relationship, which he said started for not a great reason, but the results on culture, on trade, on politics, on person-to-person ties have been remarkable, and I think will only continue to grow.
Well, we've been talking about culture. I'm a big music fan, and I know how many great artists have come out of Canada. And I think that's another area. We may not have a song and dance festival maybe this year, and we don't know when the next one will be held, but I'm hoping that there will be Canadian choirs who will be able to come and visit for the future, because that's another area where we can cooperate.
Yeah, and in fact, we had them at the last, and then the North American Song and Dance Festival was held in Toronto.
Right.
Your foreign minister was able to attend. Our then foreign minister, who's now our deputy prime minister, joined him at the Song and Dance Festival. Our past 2 Canada Days, the Canadian Military Band can go anywhere in the world. It's come to Latvia twice to perform. There's great opportunities, and it's an amazing opportunity, as an ambassador and as an embassy, to be able to show off your country when you're not working by yourself anymore. You have this wonderful backing and support. And as I said, I think I have probably the best job in the Canadian Foreign Service right now.
Well, it shows, and we really appreciate that. And I want to thank you very much for this conversation and for everything that you and your people and your country are doing for us. And I look forward to even closer ties and birch juice and maple syrup exchanges and some good hockey games, and maybe eventually we'll beat you.
Maybe.
Maybe.
You've got a Canadian coach, so it's possible.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador.